When I was in middle school, we took a class trip for a few days from our small town to the big city of Toronto. And while we were there, we went around to a whole bunch of museums, checked out the sights, and saw some culturally interesting shows, namely Phantom of the Opera. Now, that show, for anyone who's seen it, starts off with an iconic, very sinister sounding pipe organ, and that moment has really kind of stuck with me since childhood. When I got into analog synthesizers, one of the first things that popped to mind was, oh, Phantom of the Opera, I want to recreate that pipe organ patch. But when I tried to do it, or when I found some patches for other organs, they never quite had that full range of tones that I remember hearing. But recently, I watched a video where an organist named Anna Lapwood walked through how a pipe organ actually works. It's really interesting. I'll link it in the description. I thought originally that each key kind of just mapped to a bunch of pipes and that's what you get. But in reality, they have a bunch of stops that are basically on-off switches that allow them to pick the different octaves and different timbres that each pipe represents. There's usually like the clean sounding pipes. There's some that are muted, so you get a nice soft tone. And then there's others that have reeds in them, like a saxophone, so it creates a little bit more of a harsh, vibrant sound to it. So they layer all of these to get the right kind of timbre and overall tone that they want to go for in the piece of music, and they can kind of switch between them with different controls. And on top of that, pipe organs basically are a part of the building, so the quality of the reverb you get is directly related to the room that they're placed into. And so that got me thinking, what if I used my REV2 and my peak and treated them like different banks of pipes? And so in this video, I'm going to walk through creating this patch. I'm going to use the REV2 for the clean pipes, use the peak for the ones with reeds, and then tie it all together with the Zoia. But before we begin, let me give you a little teaser of what we're going to create here. Please excuse any sloppy playing. I'm still learning to get my left and right hands coordinated on the keys, but it'll be good enough to show you what we're going to do. Let's start by creating the patch on the REV2. With this instrument, I'm going to create something that's layered and represents the clean pipes in a pipe organ setup. Here's what it's going to sound like in the end. Okay, so let's start by initializing. You can do that by holding 1 and 4 on the LFO and hitting the hold button. And so now we've got basic sawtooth. When the pipes are being resonated by the airflow, it probably sounds pretty similar to a sine wave. So let's pick triangles for our oscillators. Now we're also going to, let me first stack it, and let's hold the edit layer B button so that it's editing both A and B, and pick triangles here. So now if I play, it's nice and smooth. For oscillator 1, I want it to be C4. For oscillator 2, let's go C3. And on layer A, I want it to be C2. So we get C2, C3, and C4 all represented, while C4 is a little bit stronger because it's on both layers. So let's get back to editing both, and let's mix them half. So already that sounds kind of organ-like. Basically, organs are different octaves being played together, more or less. But it sounds a little digital. It sounds kind of like, I don't know, my grandma had one of those electric organs. It sounds like that right now. It's a cool sound, but not what we're going for. So it sounds a little bit too smooth. We need a little bit more variation into it. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the shape mod. Yeah, let's put it somewhere around half. But now that's a little too bright, so let's back it off. So even that's softer, it has more of the brightness than earlier. Maybe let's bring some resonance in. But it still kind of sounds like that digital organ sound. So I'm going to use the audio mod to bring the cutoff higher so that as the oscillator vibrates, it kind of just like introduces a little bit of that natural sound into it. And maybe let's compare the layers here. So this is layer A, layer B, layer A, B. I think B is a little brighter, so let's bring that down a bit. And A. Okay, so that's good enough for now. Let's move on to the amp envelope. One of the things I want to try to replicate is a little bit of the physical property of the air rushing into the pipe, and then it excites, and then if they cut the air off, it takes a little bit of time for that vibration to be dissipated. So let's try to get that in the amp envelope a little bit. The easiest way I found is just like set sustain to 0. So you can't hear anything. And that kind of helps you figure out the timing of what you want for the attack, decay, and release. So I want it to be pretty fast. And so pretend like that's the rush of air going into the pipe, and then when you don't hear anything, we'll figure out where we want it to land. So I'm going to make the attack a little higher. I'm going to exaggerate it a bit, I think. And I'll just make decay roughly match. Bring the sustain all the way back up. And then bring it down just a bit. We don't want it to be too low like this, where it's obvious, but a little bit goes a long way. Okay, that sounds good enough. Maybe it's a little too long, but we're just going to go with that for fun. So now I want to add to that kind of perception by using the auxiliary envelope to kind of brighten it up at the first little bit, just to give it a touch more of that kind of air rushing in. I tried using noise, but it sounded a little fake. Didn't quite work correctly. But when I was experimenting, I found adding to the audio mod kind of just brightens it up for a moment, so you get a bit more of a transient to it. So let's crank up the amount. Let's do the same thing, put sustain to 0, and try to dial it in. So let's do... So you can kind of hear. But obviously that's way too long. Let's keep it pretty long though. So that as the volume kind of goes up and settles, maybe the excitement goes up and settles a little after that. I don't know if that's physically accurate, but that's what I want to do. You can hear the difference here. Yeah, you know what? I mistakenly was going to set it midpoint, but I actually want it to go to 0 so that it is there and then is gone, and then I can use the audio mod to dial in the bass amount. So far we've got a good tone going. But it doesn't quite sound like the pipe has been excited and then takes time to dissipate its energy. But there is a release, of course. But that's kind of just like the tone it produced going off into the air and getting released, not the pipe itself. And because I'm not creating a patch that's meant to be played standalone, I can actually use the reverb to kind of mimic that excitement. So let's turn it on, and we'll pick the reverb. And for now, I'm just going to put the mix to 100 so we can hear what's going on. And time to 0. Okay, so let's find the tone here. So if the time was all the way up, that would be like putting it into a room. So what I want though is for the energy to dissipate from the pipe, which would happen pretty fast. So let's turn it down a bit. Yeah, somewhere around there sounds good. Now, one thing about the tone, if I adjust it while playing this chord, you can hear that there's a bit of a sweet spot. Now that's going to be a problem if I go into a lower octave, or if I go into a much higher octave. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a mod slot to map the key tracking to the parameter 2. So the source is going to be note number, and the destination is parameter 2. Now, I'm not sure exactly how this works, but I found that if I turn the parameter all the way to 0 and then the amount for the mod slot all the way up, it more or less tracks with the key. So now if I play any note in a lower octave or a higher octave, it seems to track reasonably well. So let's turn the mix all the way down and find our sweet spot. Yeah, I think about 30 works. So off, on. You can hear that there's just that little bit of resonance on top, which adds, to my ears, a bit of realism to it. So there's another thing we can do with the mod matrix and the key tracking to make this this reverb effect a little bit more realistic. If you consider that a long pipe could be, 16 foot, 8 foot, whatever, to produce the low notes, it's going to be vibrating and it's going to take a lot more energy for it to dissipate. Thus, that effect is going to be longer. Whereas a short pipe that might be, say, 4 foot, 2 foot, or shorter, it's just going to lose its energy much, much faster. So I actually want to adjust the timing for the long, low frequency pipe to be longer, and then we'll pull it away with the key tracking. So let's go to a low octave here. And let's turn the mix all the way back up so we can actually hear it. And yeah, sure, let's just say 100. So now let's go to the source, change to mod slot 2, change it to note number, which is key tracking, and let's assign this destination to FX param 1. We know it's working for the low notes. So now let's go to the higher octaves, and that's way too long, so let's reduce the amount that gets affected the high notes. If we go all the way to negative 127, it barely affects it. Okay, I'm just gonna go negative 64 right in the middle, just so it's still there, but not too excessive. And we'll pull this back to 30 where it should be and compare high octave and lower octave. So that does sound like it's taking longer for the pipe to lose its energy versus its higher octave counterparts. And that adds a little bit of realism to it. If it takes time for the energy to dissipate from the pipe, it should also take time for energy to be put into the pipe and produce a resonance. So let's use the mod matrix again, and let's go to mod slot 3, and once again use note number. And for the destination, we're going to adjust both the attack and the decay to be shorter at the higher frequencies. So I'm going to find, what is it called here? Okay, so what I'm looking for is the end all attack. So that will affect both the cutoff amp and the auxiliary envelope. So let's go to a higher octave here just to compare. And let's go all the way down. Sorry, it's actually the opposite. You need to add to it for some reason. And so now that's extremely short. So let's put it to 0 and find the sweet spot. So that's sounding a little too short. I think 30 is probably good. Let's go 1 octave higher. And make sure they all... Yeah. So now let's do the same on mod slot 4, but for the decay. And I'm going to assume 30 is probably the same as well. So that sounds much more immediate in the higher range versus the low. Kind of a little sluggish, takes time to get there. So this is what we got so far. It sounds pretty good, but I like to have a little bit of randomization to a lot of the patches. It just adds a little bit of flavor to it and feels more organic. And on the REV2, there's a trick that people call voice component modeling, where you use the sequencer to add a bit of that variability. Now to do that, we want to use the gated sequencer. So let's switch to that. And the mode needs to be key step. And that basically means every time we hit a key, it steps to the next value in the sequence. So we want to record. So the first sequence destination is off. We're actually going to use the mod matrix to assign it. And then you have 0 to 125 with reset and rest. Basically, just pick something in the middle around 64 and add some variation to it by hand. So step 2. And there we go. It takes a bit of time, as you can see, but basically you want to repeat this for each of the 4 sequences. Now there's a little trick I'll show just at the end of sequence 2 once I've completed it. So switching to sequence 2, I'm going to do the same thing for all 16 steps. Okay, there we go. What I want is for each sequence to have a different length. So if they were all equal lengths, they would each step through in equal lockstep. But if they have different lengths and they end at different points, then they're going to become out of sync over time, adding a little bit more variability to it. So for step 16, I'm going to go all the way to the end where it says reset. And so you can set reset at any point in the sequence to add that variability to it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. We'll be right back once I get that. Okay, all 4 sequences are now set, but it's important to note that we've been editing them in layer A and B together, and they could have separate sequences. So it might be a good idea to go into layer B and just make some minor adjustments here and there just for a little bit more flavor, or even change the lengths of the sequences altogether. So I'm going to do that and I'll be right back. Okay, now layers A and B now have independent sequences and they're ready to be applied. So let's turn dual editing back on and let's save it just to make sure we don't lose all that work. So now let's apply these sequences to a few different areas to add just some subtle variation. So let's go to mod slot 5. We'll set the source to be sequence 1. And now set the destination to be, let's change the oscillator shapes. There we go. Let's change both of them. Why not? I'm going to turn it all the way up just so we can hear what it sounds like. You can hear that the timbre changes every single time I press it. Now we don't want it to be that dramatic, so I'm going to pull it back to a very small value just to add a little bit of flavor. Let's say 8. There we go. So let's go to the next mod slot and we will change it to sequence 2. And we're going to change this destination to be the attack, so that every time you press the key, maybe there's a little bit of variation in the airflow that goes in. So let's find the attack for all. Okay, so envol attack, and let's turn the amount all the way up again just to hear the difference. Actually, we want to go the opposite direction. Let's make it longer by going negative. Now that's way too long, so I'm going to go -5. Again, it's not necessarily something you'll actively hear. If you are, it's probably too much. It's just adding some subtle variation to things. Okay, and mod slot 7, let's do sequence 3, and we are going to assign that to the oscillator mixed. And again, let's just go with 10 just to get some variation. Okay, so that's too much. Maybe 5? So there's one note in the sequence that's a little brighter than others. So if you were actually programming this, you might want to go through and get the values a little closer to 64, just so it's kind of even. Depends how much variability you want. For now, I'm just going to leave it so we can move on. So we'll just save that. So this is what we've got so far. Sounding pretty good, but I think I want to add a little bit of stereo spread to it. So I'm going to do something that people call binaural audio. I'm not entirely sure if their use of that word is correct. I think that has more to do with how the audio bounces in your ear canal. But basically, we're going to have the left and the right be a little bit more prominent in layer A and layer B. So to do that, we first need to go into the global parameters and change pan mode from alternate to fixed. So basically alternate, if you turn up the pan, it'll go left, right, left, right, left, right, one after the other per voice. And with fixed, you can assign layer A and layer B a fixed amount of panning. So let's set that up first, and then we're going to augment it a little bit. So we're going to go to the 8th mod slot, which is the last one, and we'll assign the source to be, for now, we're going to set it to DC, which is basically a fixed value. And then the destination is going to be pan. Let's change the amount all the way to -127. So now hopefully you're listening with headphones or a stereo set of monitors, but basically it should be in the left channel. And let's edit layer B to be +127. So now layer B is on the right, layer A is on the left. And so if we cycle between the two, we can just double check that. Layer B, A, and if we stack them, now they play together. And that doesn't sound too bad, but I actually still want it to be mostly centered, just a little bit off. So let's adjust those values to something more like 10, -10, and 10. So it'll be a little closer to center. And now on top of that, let's use the fourth sequence to vary that a little bit. So we'll set the source to be sequence 4. So the panning will now be changed. And that's just kind of a nice way of adding a little bit of spread to this. And so now let's do a little bit of final adjustments here. I think it's a little bright. I'm going to bring it down a bit. On layer A, I'm going to turn the pole off. Let's see what does that sound like. Okay, so that's pretty close to what I had. It's definitely a little bit different because I'm trying to go through this quickly for the sake of time. But one final step that I wanted to do was detune the entire instrument to give it a little bit of a darker tone to it. So let's adjust both layers here and turn the fine tune down by, let's say 30 cents. So now it sounds, it sounds a little off, I guess, but together I found that if you had everything perfectly in tune, it sounded just fine, but I found that the slight detune gave it a little bit more of that sinister nature that I was going for. All right, now we're on to the Novation peak, and we're going to create the reed-like sound, so it'll have more of a vibration to it, and this is what I've created previously. So it's not smooth, it definitely has that like brrr sound to it where you would expect from a reed. So let's get started. So I'm going to initialize. And we're back to our normal patch. I like the idea of having all three oscillators be these sine waves where one was 8 foot, 16 foot, and 2 foot. But that didn't sound very good in terms of having a reed structure. Now, I'm just going to save us some time and say that I experimented with all of the different wave tables. And I found that having carousel for both of them gave me what I was looking for on oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. So oscillator 1 is 8 foot to kind of represent the standard tone that I'm going for when you press a key, 16 foot to get some of that sub in there, and then 2 foot with a sine wave to have a little bit of high resonance. So let's just turn them all down and see what they sound like. So here's the 8 foot. And that doesn't sound at all like what I was going for. So what I need to do is find the shape that works here. So I don't want high. But I think that sounds reasonably okay. Let's move on to the 16 foot. And around the same point, maybe a little lower. And so now on the final one, let's see what this sounds like. And just for context, I'm playing an octave right now with my left hand. So I wanted this one to be a little high to create some high-pitched overtones, or I don't know what it's called. That's what I'm calling it. But so if I do that and then reduce the frequency a bit, let's say around there for now. So let's find where we want everything. I'm just going to start with everything about 50%, give or take. Somewhere around there. Now, before I continue on, let's get that same detuning that I did on the REV2. So negative 30 cents on each of these, just so we don't get used to hearing it in the wrong tune. Okay, just quick save. Okay, so let's dial in the filter. There's a be a little higher so I get that resonance. Let's add some resonance, but not too much. Maybe a little bit of filter 3, just to get that buzz. And maybe for the high notes, fully open it up with the key track. So for the peak, I want the envelope to be a little bit longer than on the REV2 because I'm using lower notes as the basis here. Sure, and then so let's come back to the drive. I want some drive in there. Okay, let's keep it around there for now. We're gonna come back to that. But it sounds more powerful, has more of a punch to it. Let's do the same trick with the reverb to create some of that sort of faux resonance to it. So let's turn it all the way up. Oh, the reverb on this is so nice, but unfortunately we don't want that. I guess the initialized value is 90. Let's turn it all the way down. And so there's a problem. Oh yeah, in the effects menu, come all the way over to reverb. There's a pre-delay. I actually don't want the pre-delay. So the pre-delay is kind of like the first bounce on the far wall of our room, but because we're using this to excite the pipes, basically we want it to be immediate. Since I'm in here, I know the low pass. I know from previous patch making that 80 was kind of the right value to get the right kind of tone I was going for. That's the kind of thing you could play with though. Oh yeah, I also forgot to change the type to 1, and that's basically getting this reverb size to 0 so that it's very, very short. It kind of defaults on a much longer scale. Okay, so now we can tweak the time a bit. And I kind of like that. That feels like, ooh, it's got some power to it. Okay, let's add a little bit of spread to this. Now, if we come into the voice menu, I want diverge. That's too much. We can't go quite as far as we can on the REV2 in shaping that, but I don't think we need to because this is representing the lower octave, so it should mostly sit in the center. Another thing I'm going to adjust, you might not hear it because I'll probably make this part quieter, but I'm going to put the patch level down to 0. I know once I finish up this patch is way too loud compared to what the REV2 is producing in my setup. So let's compare different octaves. So this is standard octave, higher, and lower. So it's sounding reasonably good across the octaves, but if we compare the higher ones, at the higher octaves it should sound a little more clear, whereas in the lower ones, like you would expect to hear the vibration of a reed. And I'm going to increase the overdrive on the filter. Okay, that's too much. All right. I like that, but if we come back to a much higher octave, it sounds too buzzy. So let's use the mod matrix to pull that down a bit. On the first one, first slot, let's choose keyboard, so key tracking. Filter drive, there we go. Not quite enough, so let's repeat that. One of the cool things with this mod matrix is you can kind of stack things, which I love. Oops, not the pitch. Forgot to set my destination to the filter drive. So you can hear that kind of quiets it up a little bit. It's still quite buzzy, but if we compare to the lower octave, not nearly as much. So now if I play a standard chord in the middle, it feels a little better. You know what, this whole time I forgot to return the level down on the reverb. So I've been kind of just patch designing by memory more than actually ear, so apologies for that. Let's turn it off. It's not too different, but you You can definitely hear the difference though. Okay, so I'll keep it off for the moment, but let's dial it back in now that I've realized my mistake. I know it should only be just a little bit. And what we want to do is have the same sort of key tracking where on the low notes it has more time, but on the high notes it's basically close to 0. So let's go into the effects menu where it has its own mod matrix for the effects. And we'll pick the source to be keyboard and the destination, the reverb time. So on the low notes, this works a little differently in that if you dial it down, -64, it seems to add to the low notes and subtract from the high notes. I'm not sure if that's exactly how it works. That's just kind of how I've observed it. So let's find a good value. All right, that sounds good enough. Let's move on to the Zoia. So here's what we're going to do with this patch. Let's imagine that we're sitting in a large cathedral in one of the front rows, right next to the instrument. You're going to hear it immediate. The sound waves are going to come from the pipes right into your ears. But they're also going to be reflecting off the walls to the side, and they're also going to go all the way to the back and come back to the front and bounce all over the place, and that's basically what reverb is. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of stereo spread to it just for some flavor. Gonna add a delay so that we can get kind of that first bounce that we would hear, and then layer a couple of different reverb modules so that we can capture some of the high frequencies that dissipate fast and some of the low frequencies that would build up over time. So let's begin with the input, output, and a stereo spread just to get started. So audio input and an audio output, and I'm going to turn the gain control on so I can balance the on and off state of the patch to be roughly equivalent. Now I'm going to put a spread on the second page just because I want to use the first page for a little bit more interesting things, and it's, where is that? It's in the audio modules towards the bottom, stereo spread, and we'll just keep it default. So let's map the inputs and the outputs. And so if I have the patch off and on, should be roughly the same. But let's boost the side by, 275 is good. Okay, next we're going to add some delay. So if we're sitting in this large room, the first time we hear a reflection is going to be all the way from the back of the room, and then once it hits our ears. Usually in reverb modules, they consider this the pre-delay. As far as I found on the Zoia, none of the reverb modules have a pre-delay. So let's add a couple of delay lines. That's under the audio module, and if you scroll down a little bit, it's right there. I don't think this gives you a stereo option, so we need to add 2 of them. But first, let's set it to the length we want, which in this case, let's put it at about 60 milliseconds. And then let's copy it and paste. So now let's map the inputs and the outputs. And I've already been playing around with this, and I know I want it to be pretty quiet, so I'm going to go down to -9 for that. Wrong one, because I keep forgetting this has the gain at the end. So let's do that again. 9 and 9. There we go. So now we'll have a little bit of a delay mixed in with our original stereo spread. Okay, before we continue, I'm just going to move this over one space because I keep mixing it up here. Next, we're going to take the delayed signal and run it through a filter so we get the high frequencies, put that into a reverb, and make it decay faster than we want the final result to be. So we're going to add an SV filter. I don't want the low pass output, I want the high pass output. And this is another one that only works with a single channel, so we're going to need 2 of them. But first, let's dial it in how we want. So if we take the left delay, and let's take the output and temporarily put it in. So I'm only going to hear that in the left ear. It's going to be maybe a little loud. Let's dial in the frequency that we want. And you can hear, if I go all the way from the bottom to the top, you'll hear kind of some of that low end disappear from the overloaded signal. Maybe let's just say around 2500. That's probably good enough. And let's delete that connection and copy this, paste. Now that should not be mapped to the left channel. It should be mapped to the, where's the input? There's the input, to the right channel. Now that we've got a filtered signal, let's connect it to a reverb. Come down to effects. We're going to choose a hall reverb. Now this one, I want the signal to dissipate by about 3 seconds. So let's get the outputs of the left and the right filtered signal connected. Let's get a tone shaper in there. Now tone control, thankfully you can set it to stereo. And get the output there. And we'll connect that to the final output. So now we can hear the delay. You can hear that the high frequencies kind of persist a little longer. So just to be safe, let's drop the low EQ down again. Even though we've got it filtered out, I don't want it to be building up in any way. The frequency, let's drop it down to match roughly what we had for the filter. And the mix, we're going to push it way up. And the reason for that is because we already have the delayed signal being applied directly to the outputs with that -9 decibel adjustment. So we don't need to add it again. But I'm going to keep it a little bit in there just for some flavor. So at 80% should be good. Now let's hear what it sounds like again. Maybe we'll boost the mid a little bit and boost the high a little bit. These are the kind of settings that we would come back to later once the full patch is built. And we're going to drop that down as well because it doesn't need to be that loud. Let's say maybe -8 and we'll see what that sounds like. There, you can kind of hear it in the background. So the last thing we're going to do is add another reverb unit with a tone control that's going to represent the full spectrum of the sound, and it's going to last much longer. So it's going to be the reverb that you probably notice the most, whereas the others kind of add a little bit of the flavor for realism. First things first, let's go to the second page, and we're going to add the hall reverb again, and we'll add another tone control. I always forget where things are in this. There we go. And make sure that's in stereo. And we'll just connect that since we're on the page, and we'll connect the outputs since we're here as well. And we're going to grab the delay again, not the filter, because we want the full spectrum. Get it to the input and grab the delay, and I believe we should hear it. There we go. Now for this one, I want it to be very long. I'm going to bump it all the way up to, let's say, 6 and a bit. The low EQ, I actually want to boost that up to kind of mimic some of the bass buildup that might happen in real life. I'll leave the high frequency where it is. And again, we're going to mix high. I'm going to say 80 again, because the reflection is already represented and the first bounce is already represented. So we don't need to duplicate that. Let's hear what that sounds like. Oh, that sounds deep and powerful. Let's push it a little farther. Let's push the low up a little longer. Maybe bring the mid down a little. And maybe bring the high down a little bit. I really want this to represent the big booming sound. Okay, that's great. But let's reduce the amount that it's into the mix. And if I look at my reference patch, I know around -6 seemed to work out pretty well. We get that deep tone if we go into the lower octaves. And in the very high shrill notes. Well, it's been a long one, and if you're still around, I want to thank you for watching, and I hope you got something out of it. It was a fun experience for me to go through and build something that was a little more intentionally designed, and now I can finally play something that I've always wanted to play.